it's a good time for all of us, for all universities to question and say what we have been doing historically, was that the best? What are some elements we can keep from that? And what are some elements that we change? Because, change is possible now and we can do things differently. So, I think it's a good time to revisit what we have been doing for a long time, almost without thinking.
I think in the best interest of time, we can begin. Our members will keep joining in. So I can see many from the fraternity here already. And thank you everyone for taking the time out and joining in today. And welcome to the Blue Circle. It's such a big privilege and a pleasure to reconnect with everyone, our distinguished panelists who are handpicked because of the think input and the rich experience that they bring in. And thank you to our distinguished audience for joining us, most of whom who are CEOs, CXOs, and senior leaders. Many of them are our members and repeat visitors to our webinars, which is very encouraging and motivates us to provide high levels of dialogue through the online channels as well. And for those of you who are new with us today, the Blue Circle is the world's first sector-specific networking app for business leaders that's built in India. We currently focus on 20 sector communities, such as education, e-mobility, energy, real estate, healthcare, logistics, and many more. We also present socioeconomic insights, which ultimately determine the evolving complexion of the market. And along with our weekly webinar series and our digital publication, you'll be happy to know that we very recently launched the first version of the Blue Circle app, which is curated for leaders. It is somewhat like the sector-specific LinkedIn for senior leaders, a space to have meaningful conversations, connect with 5,000 plus like-minded leaders from India and across the globe, house high-quality curated content, and also it provides access to business opportunities across our core sectors. For those leaders who are interested, please do join us. I will share the link to the app in the chat section and will soon send out invitations to our new guests post the webinar as well. And today we're privileged to have big minds and leading thinkers of the industry join in for our education community's discussion. The topic is the changing landscape of education and executive education. And now, just in the best interest of time, I will just briefly mention the names and designations of the panelists who have joined us today. We have with us Dr.Soumitra Dutta, author, GII, and professor, Cornell University, United States of America. And our chair and moderator for this session is Mr. Pavan Choudary, who's also a best-selling author, a chairman with Blue Circle, lead investor, and sits on several boards across the country, across sectors such as healthcare, education, and geopolitics. So welcome everybody. It's an absolute privilege to have you all. I now request Mr. Choudary to please chair and moderate the session.
Thank you, Siddharth, and welcome Dr. Soumitra Dutta. What a pleasure to have you with us. Your work in innovation, as well as your participation at Davos, and moving the agenda forward on that metrics is known to everyone. Before we start the session, let me just perimeter the discussion so that we can bring out the best of Soumitra, who is very widely read, into the space that we have agreed to speak about. So if you look at education, there are three goods which education provides. One is understanding of life through history, science, philosophy. Second is enjoyment of life through friendship, appreciation of literature, art, etc. And third is control of life by developing intelligence, technology, management thinking, techniques, etc. We will speak about this last portion, control of life mainly. However, I'm sure the discussion may have traces of the other sides also, particularly the social interaction or social fluidity which exposure to education brings. So this is broadly what we will talk about. And on that note, Soumitra, I would like to ask you how the content and pedagogy of education has changed over centuries or the last century? Soumitra.
No, thank you so much, Pavan, for having me on your program. It's a pleasure to be invited to have this discussion. Having the discussion with you itself is an honor. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Education is something which every society has valued for centuries. So, education and the creation and the passage of knowledge across generation is something that as a race or as a society we have done for centuries. And if you look at what education has tried to do is, of course, impart skills, skills for survival, for earning a living, for doing a job. Education has also tried to get people to think about bigger issues, bigger issues linked to humanity, the ultimate goal of sort of people and societies, character, the role of character in building the future, and so on. So I do believe that a lot of that has changed over time, and a lot of that has not changed over time. So if you look at the content side, clearly the skills required for survival, for job success have evolved. The skills you need today for succeeding in a job are different from what you needed even 20 years ago, and so much more different than what you needed 100 or 200 years ago. 100 years ago, there was no computers. Computers were not part of the kind of skills you needed to succeed in a job. Today, if you don't have basic computational skills, you cannot actually work in any job. You need to be able to send emails, do video conferencing, handle Excel spreadsheets, and so on. So I think the kind of skills we need for different jobs and different roles in society have, of course, evolved, and they'll keep on evolving. So, the technology is changing, technology is evolving. The kind of skills and kind of things that are important for success will keep on changing. At the same time, some other skills haven't necessarily changed in terms of how you relate to people. Yes, today we relate to people also via technology, but a lot of the leadership aspects, a lot of the team building aspects have still stayed quite similar at the core, because human beings fundamentally, we haven't changed too much as social animals. We are social animals, a couple of thousand years ago, and we are still social animals today. And a lot of those societal relationship related skills or leadership aspects are still relevant today. And that's one reason why even today we study the leadership skills of ancient kings, or of generals before. So the reason we study them is because those skills that the historical leaders had, whether Napoleon or whether Alexander, whatever, whoever you choose, are still relevant today in a different context, still relevant. So I think in the skill side, there's a lot of change, and some not really high degree of change. I think what had not changed really was the method of delivery. So the method of delivery of educating people, of passing of knowledge, was very much in person, the Gurukul kind of mode. You work in smaller groups with the instructor, knowledgeable faculty, and you learn and acquire knowledge from the person through close interactions. And that mode of learning has been with us since, Indian ancient times, and also the Greek ancient times. And if you look at, in fact, how classrooms are structured today in most universities, it is really a modern version of that. So in some sense, the way of transmitting knowledge, the way of conducting classes really did not change for thousands of years. Of course, now with COVID and all the COVID-induced changes, things are looking forward to a different future. But I would say, to answer your question, we have seen some changes on the skill side, and some, I think, a high degree of consistency in terms of leadership, people issues, people management side, and a lot of the delivery side.
So content has changed significantly, and pedagogy hasn't kept pace till COVID came. Once COVID came, Samit, the testing which is related to admissions, the knowledge acquisition on the campus, off campus, the certification and placement, how have they changed?
I think, COVID has forced us to rethink many aspects. Um, the global pandemic, the global lockdowns have been unprecedented. I mean, that is something, just to think that in India, the school level exams were not held, or in France, the back exam at the end of school wasn't held, or the A levels were not held, is something that people could not even conceive of. If you ask me, would this ever happen in a country, and India I would have said never, But the fact is that we were locked into one way of doing things, because it's a habit that had grown over many centuries, and we had evolved into a pattern of doing things. And doesn't matter the pattern was good or bad, we did it, we repeated it. And sometimes that happens. If you look at, for example, the English keyboard layout, QWERT, it is not the best layout for typing fast. In fact, as some of you know, the layout was chosen deliberately to slow down typists, because initially when you had mechanical typewriters, we typed too fast, the keys would jam. So they said, if you have to slow down typing, so that's the reason why they made the layout to be non-ideal for fast typing. So, but still we adopted, we haven't changed it. And I think something similar was happening in the education space, where we got used to one way of doing things. And, the COVID has shaken us up. So it's provided a wake-up call. It's provided a wake-up call at a level at which you have been forced to rethink what you have been doing. And the fact that, you could not have the regular assessment exams, the fact that assessment had to move at a different level, has forced institutions all over the world to rethink the criteria, rethink the basis on which they admit people. And some of this actually can have positive effect. For example, there was a lot of, in India, the elite institutions like IITs, they are largely meritocratic. So you're good in your studies, hopefully you have a good chance of getting into these top colleges. In many countries, there is a fairly strong bias in favor of the elite. So let's say, for example, in England, where you have Oxford and Cambridge, two of the elite universities, historically, a lot of the graduates of the elite public schools, they were typically going into Oxford, Cambridge, like Eton and other schools. They were the ones going into Cambridge in larger numbers, and Oxford in larger numbers. And there was a lot of criticism, a lot of complaints about how and why can we actually make the pool more diverse and make the pool more inclusive, include more people from poorer backgrounds, for example. And that was very hard to change, because the system was designed to, support that kind of admission process. And now this year, for the first time, when there was no school level sort of exams that were held, the A levels were not held in the UK too, they had to resort to a different kind of an approach. And interestingly, the different approach they used was an algorithmic approach. They went to a computer algorithm for deciding, what kind of grades and what kind of suitability for admission to Oxford, Cambridge. And the end result this year is that for the first time in history, in the 800-year history of Oxford, the elite schools, students are a minority. Okay, so this actually by many has been seen as a positive change that was very hard to do. Even people recognized it very hard to do, but then the pandemic created the situation, the context in which that could be done. So I do think that now is a good time for everyone to look at the way we, assess students when they enter, we assess students when they exit after the finishing of a course, and we try to understand better how we in fact you know look at the multiple different parameters that actually make up for a student performance, a student personality as a whole. Because you don't only measure academic performance, you look at the whole total personality of a student to, in fact, see how the person grows, how the person can contribute to the university and to the school. So I think now with more uh, different approaches possible, it's a good time for all of us, for all universities to question and say, what we have been doing historically, was that the best? What are some elements we can keep from that? And what are some elements that we change? Because, change is possible now and we can do things differently. So, I think it's a good time to revisit what we have been doing for a long time, almost without thinking.
Correct. You mentioned UK. And last I remember I was there. And out of curiosity, I asked the driver of my cabs, which have a very circular roof, and it is not a flat roof because it is non-streamlined. So he had the answer. He told me it is because in older times when the automobile came, people used to wear a long hat, tall hat. So this was to allow them to enter and sit comfortably. So the inertia of convention, COVID, you're saying, has shaken up. And it has, let us say, democratized the entry to these elite schools, which because of convention was stuck up and unchanging. This is democratization within the borders of a country. Do you think that now, because of the fact that education has gone so much online, there will be cross-border democratization? Because IITs, which you mentioned, are so very difficult to get into. You are yourself from IIT Delhi, so you know that. So difficult to get into. And similar institutes in other countries have a much lower bar. That means many deserving people from countries like India do not make it to the highest portals of quality education because the congestion here is too much, the congestion of competition. Do you think that onlining of education will democratize cross-border education also, opportunities also?
I think it'll democratize both inside a country and cross-border, absolutely. If I look at the basic assumption in education today is high quality and small groups, exclusivity. So people actually pay a premium and assign a premium for exclusivity. So if I can actually have a small group and have a high quality experience, that is considered to be great education. In fact, the rankings and all support that kind of a model. And this whole model comes back from the Gurukul kind of a model in which you have a teacher and a small group next to the person. And today, if you think of the need for education, how many students out there need education? The need is so much higher than what this elite institution can provide, or even the good institutions, forget elite, even the good set of institutions can provide. In India is a good example of that, but even globally, the supply and demand is highly mismatched. The demand is several orders of magnitude higher than the supply today that is available in the good schools. So I think what we need to do is we need to question that basic model and question whether or not we need to change the model of education. Because we have taken one model of education and assumed that that is the best, okay? And what is the basic assumption in the Gurukul structure is that, okay, the teacher understands the student the best. I have been a teacher for 30 years now, and I can tell you it's next to impossible for a teacher to actually understand each and every student in his or her class. You do identify a few of the great students who come and talk to you and you understand them, what their aspirations are, what the dreams are, what the challenges are. You do sometimes talk to a few of the students, but maybe only 10% of the class. The rest 90% for you is usually is a group, and then you teach to the group. And I can tell you that's the reality of classroom-based teaching, especially when you're teaching multiple courses. A faculty member typically teaches at least 6 different groups the whole year. It's not stuck with a group of 10 for the whole 4 years. You're typically teaching 6, 7 groups of 50, 60 people every time. So even as a human being, we are incapable of providing that personalized instruction to individuals. So what I'm just pointing out is the limitation of the current structure, that people believe is a strength. So people believe the strength of the current system is that I can actually understand a student's needs better, I can customize students better. And the reality is that you actually are unable to do it for everyone. Maybe 10% of the class, not for 90% of the class. Now, the good thing is now technology has come in that actually enables you to do a lot of that and support a lot of it online. With technology, you can actually follow more precisely the learning path of students. Now, we haven't reached a point at which it is being done for every subject, but in principle, the possibility is there to be able to identify, when you do a course online, they are actually able to monitor and see how much time you spent on which problem. Did you succeed or not? And then if you did this problem wrong, did you get the next problem wrong? Or if you got this problem right, did you actually succeed in getting the next problem right? They can look at learning paths. And if you do it on a large scale, you can actually get very good machine learning data about which learning paths are more appropriate for what kind of backgrounds. We haven't been able to apply that today in universities, but what I'm saying is that the future is such that you actually may be able to use technology to complement and support teachers. And by doing so, you may actually be able to increase the number of people you serve, because technology allows you to scale up. Scaling up is a critical issue. Today, you look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, education is one of the goals. And education, we know that we'll never have enough teachers. The classical model will never have enough teachers in many lifetimes. So we are actually leaving a large part of the global population, underdeveloped, not leveraging to the full potential, and doing actually great disservice to them, great harm to them. So what I would say is that it's time to once again rethink what we value in education. Do we value the small numbers, high quality? Or do we actually value giving good quality to many more numbers? When I studied computer science at IIT Delhi, in my class, there was like 50 or 60 students. I went back 25 years later for a reunion, and guess what? The number had not changed. It had gone from 60 to 80. And I thought, this is such a crime. You have this great talent of IIT Delhi, and we are still only graduating 80 computer science professionals. The country needs so many more. So I think we need to basically think more actively about how to grow the numbers. And technology today allows us to do so. We can change the business model of education by leveraging technology appropriately. And that is something that we have to understand and keep in mind.
Yeah, you're right. Earlier, it was more dependent on the student, or maximum is marks, as to, let us say we had these sections in our classes. Class 9th has section A, B, C, D. And frankly speaking, let me confess, my desire was to be in whichever section there were more girls. And my father somehow understood this, ulterior motive of my wanting to join section D, though the topics or the subjects now I realize which would have more interested me lay in other sections. Now, with the help of technology, you are saying we can understand learning paths, aptitudes of cohorts, we can also realize, and I'm sure you do that too. I have also been a teacher in my, let me say, as an avocation, I've pursued this. I realized that I was maybe perhaps very good at teaching X subject, like marketing or advertising, but not so good at finance at all. So that one teacher understands the entire universe of knowledge and he understands student, you are right. Most of the students are a blur. It is only a few students who are, let me say, more extrovertish or who have greater social fluidity who really come close to the teacher and he understands them. And what you are saying is that this high quality small group thing stands completely challenged by technology. And you've also explained how it is challenged. On another occasion, when we were talking, Soumitra, you were speaking about technology is a three-stage process. It begins with adoption and goes on to transformation. So what are those stages and where do we stand right now as far as development of educational technology online is concerned?
No, thank you for asking the question. I studied technology for many years now, in fact, 30 years, and I like one very simple framework for looking and conceptualizing the impact of technology on our lives. So this simple framework says there are three orders of impact. The first order of impact is when a new technology is created and essentially you substitute the old by the new. So in many ways, for example, you can think of, people are traveling by horse carriages, the car is invented, you stop traveling by horse carriages, you travel by car. You are using the fixed line telephone for calling, the mobile phone is invented, and you switch from the fixed line to the mobile phone. The first order of impact is substitution. The second order of impact is diffusion. Diffusion meaning that more and more people are using the new technology because it is cheaper, it is higher quality, it is better in some sense. So just because the technology is better, people start using it more and more. And that's one reason why there is, let's say, a higher level of acceptance of technology in society. The second order of impact is diffusion. The third order is the interesting one, which is one of transformation, where fundamentally new ways of living and working are emerging just because the technology allows you to do so. So if you think of this whole concept of shopping malls, of suburbs, that has become possible because, you can live somewhere else and use the car to drive somewhere else for work or for shopping. And similarly, mobile phones have created a different whole way of living and working and socializing. Social media, for example, has become very popular thanks to mobile telephony. Now, if you look at these three orders of impact, substitution, diffusion, and transformation, what one can argue is that COVID and the pandemic lockdown has forced everyone to go very rapidly up the first two orders, which is substitution and diffusion. You had to move to remote learning and education, and you had to do it for all disciplines, not just in one discipline. So everyone had to do it. Good or bad, didn't work well, worked well, you had to do it. Now the challenge is sitting in this stage of large-scale diffusion, what is the future we're trying to build? And the two possibilities. Either we keep moving up that framework and you say, okay, well, let's look at now that technology has been used widely, how can we change the way we learn, change the way we educate ourselves, change the way programs are structured, and create a new future? The other option is we say, okay, look, we had a comfortable zone, a zone of comfort of operations before the pandemic, and let's rush back to that zone of comfort. And my concern is that increasingly what I see is a lot of universities, a lot of schools essentially choosing the second option of going back to the in-person instruction. The in-person instruction is not just a question of how you teach, it's a whole business model with that. A business model that requires buildings, a business model that requires in-person hiring faculty. So there was a business model that was there in universities of the resources, the capital expenditure, the method of instruction that was seeming to work, at least with the universities from their perspective, narrow perspective. And many universities are now, in fact, choosing to go back out there. I'll tell you, for example, in many universities in America, faculty and staff have been told that if you don't actually come back to your office, if you don't come back to in-person teaching, you're essentially going to be fired. Okay, it's as simple and direct as that. You're going to be fired if you don't come back. So they're basically forcing the system to come back to what I call the back to the future scenario. And really what I think at this moment should happen is, schools, universities should be looking and trying to ask the question, okay, we have gone through a substitution, which was very forced, very rapid. Some things work, some things did not work. Let's try to actually imagine the future, and let's try to see what kind of a future might be possible, might be available for us in education. And how do we create the future? Because that future will require a lot of experimentation, a lot of taking risks, a lot of launching of new ideas and new programs. So the challenge really out there is, how do you create the new future in that context of education? And for that, we need leadership. You need leadership. You need leaders who need to come and say that, well, guess what? These end of school year exams that we have had, they're not very useful. So let's stop them. And let's actually think of redoing assessment in a different way. Let's have more continuous piecemeal assessment. Maybe we need leaders who come and question and say, well, maybe this 4-year program or the 3-year undergraduate program structure we had is not the most useful for students in helping find jobs. Let's think of different ways to create programs that connect them much more to industry and connect them much more to what is happening on the ground inside companies. So I think we need to experiment, and some experiments have already happened even before the pandemic. It's like many things in life, you don't have to discover everything from scratch. People have been trying different ideas, already in different parts of the world. You have to pick them up, adapt them for the local context, adapt them with the local technology that is available right now, and then basically push them out. So I would say it is much more a question of this experimentation, this willingness to learn, willingness to try to essentially create a new future, which hopefully is a better future, as opposed to just rushing back to the old comfort zone, which we know is not adequate, because we know that the old comfort zone will never solve the education problem for society. And it's not clear today that universities are actually producing graduates who are prepared for success in the work environment. So the current system that we had before the pandemic itself had deficiencies. And if you just rush back to that, I'm not sure that's the right outcome for all of us.
So do you would be knowing if many professors or faculty have hesitated to go back to the physical mode of teaching, face-to-face mode of teaching. What's your comment on that? Secondly, the socialization aspect, which education provided in its current model, where the student was in a particular campus and he had the opportunity of face-to-face interactions, building relationships, understanding those human dynamics of life. How would the new model, if it doesn't have, imagine at all physical interaction, imagine a space like that, though I know that there will be some hybrid kind of a model. How will that model work or compensate for its weaknesses? Soumitra.
Yeah, so I think, most people agree that the future is going to be hybrid. So I think with a few exceptions, and no one believes that it'll be all fully remote or all fully, in one direction. The question is, what is the nature of that hybrid environment going to look like? Today, earlier, before I came for this interview, I was talking to a group of executives, and we're talking about the hybrid remote sort of workplace of the future. And a similar issue is arising out there. And how do you create that hybrid remote workplace of the future? And what you find is that it's not just a question of assuming that the technology will not change. Technology is changing very rapidly, it's growing exponentially. So in some sense, what we have right now, Zoom, Zoom itself has changed so much in 1.5 years. And in 5 years' time, there might be a better Zoom, or there might be different software that we might end up using. So the technology support for learning is going to keep on changing. So that's the first thing. So it's not that the technology support learning is stable and this is what is the state of the art. This is just the start of the whole technology supported learning. So learning software will improve and become better. And having said that, I think for all teachers and universities, we'll have to rethink the model of how much teaching is done online, how much is done in person. And the reality is that there are good examples of why you might prefer to, in fact, be in person, or why you might prefer to be online. I teach a course in hybrid mode at Cornell. So basically, I am there in the classroom. So I'm actually physically in the classroom because I'm required to also, as I mentioned. But the students have the option of either being in the classroom or being in their rooms or wherever they are. And what I can tell you is that roughly 70% come to the class and 30% stay in the rooms. And that 30% who stays remote is very different reasons why they stay remote. I teach often executives, executive MBAs, and sometimes they just prefer to stay remote because they have a family constraint, they have to look after the child, or because they don't want to have the traffic. The traffic is a big pain to come in 1 hour traffic each way, or just simply because they have other things to look after. So the flexibility to adjust to what suits you is very interesting. And I think that's something what is now increasingly called as a liquid degrees. Liquid degrees basically are degrees that adapt. Like you pour a liquid and the liquid takes the shape of whichever vessel you pour it in. So you want the learning degrees to be adaptable to a student's requirements, student's demands. So if I like to do it fully remote, great. If I like to do it part remote, part in person, great. So I should have the flexibility to adjust. The flexibility is very important out here. But also what is very important is that I'll give you one anecdote from South Korea. So in South Korea in 2020, when the pandemic first came, they did have a lockdown, but the lockdown was very short because they controlled the pandemic and the virus quite quickly early on. And so the dean of one school in South Korea told me that his students said, after the pandemic, short lockdown in Korea was that they told the dean, please continue with the online classes, but please organize more social events and the career services in person on campus. So they actually made a preference saying that, look, for the classes, we prefer to keep the classes online. And even simple things, many students tell me the fact they can record the thing and they can go back and review it. It's a huge benefit for them because they don't always catch everything in the classroom. So the possibility you can go back and review is by itself a very important benefit of learning. And if we can actually, like in the South Korean example, think of how you can have in-person social interactions, then that is a very powerful, option, a powerful method of getting things done. So what I'm just trying to say is that these kind of things are happening, and these kind of changes will happen in education. And it is for us to experiment and see, how do we create the right combination? I'm not saying that the unique one combination is good for every discipline, every university. You might have different universities choose different models. You might have different departments in university choose different models. So these things can vary quite significantly.
You're absolutely right. In fact, as far as the non-social side of knowledge acquisition is concerned, there are currents which were emerging even pre-COVID. In Japan, there is a tribe of people called Hokikomoris. Hokikomoris are those people who do not like to interact with human beings. They only want to interface with technology, with gadgets, with machines, etc. And their reason is very clear. The reason is that interpersonal relations are stressful. Interactions are stressful. They can cause stress and distress. Machines don't judge, they don't tire, they don't insult. So, and this tribe is already growing. And I have seen it in my nieces and nephews also, the strains of this tribe. Because even pre-COVID, I'm sure you also would be having youngsters who know each other, who are sitting in the same room, who are friends, but they are corresponding with by WhatsApp. So, so I feel that the offline space isn't so very vital, especially when we are talking about non-social acquisition of knowledge. Another friend of mine, who's also a professor, the other day was telling me that I miss the pat which I used to give to a student. I miss those interactions. So I told him that Bible has only 3 colors. The Bible has only 3 colors. Because that time our vocabulary was limited, not that there were only 3 colors. And now that our vocabulary has expanded, we have thousands of words for colors. So our digital vocabulary will expand, if not 100% substitute face-to-face interactions. Our emojis and whatever is going to come in future will partially at least substitute for those face-to-face interactions by the expansion of the lexicon. And lastly, what you said was very right. And I was reminded of Parmenides' fallacy, which says that we cannot compare a future scenario which we are imagining with the current scenario. We have to compare it with another future scenario and then decide which combination should work. Because if we compare it with current scenario, there might be certain strengths which we have right now, which we might not be able to imagine in future, or substitutes we might not be able to imagine. So beautiful points. Soumitra, regarding the professors and faculty, you have spoken about democratization of content and democratization of education. What about democratization of delivery? Because professors and faculty, especially in pedigree universities, were coming from those pedigree universities or other pedigree universities. There were very few eklavs reaching into the faculty. And it was a kind of a closed system. So how do you think that circle, will it expand? Will it break? Will the new professorial class reach in, which has already earned its spurs in the online space? Soumitra.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question and a very good point you're making, is who actually imparts knowledge to whom? And historically, it was the case that people thought it was a small group of, knowledge professionals, professors, if you want to call them, who had the knowledge, the gurus, and they gave knowledge to other people. Today, we're moving to a world, thanks to social media, thanks to the internet, where knowledge is much more democratized. And the general feeling is that you can learn from anyone. Anyone can, in fact, teach others. Whether it's teaching a complex subject or whether it's teaching, flower arrangement, you can teach different things and everyone can teach something. So if we are able to open up our minds and accept the fact that we all learn and we all can learn from each other, Then you start hitting at some of the constraints we've imposed on the whole faculty body in universities. In most top universities, you need a PhD to become a professor. The PhD by itself is a barrier to entry, so you're already putting a barrier of saying, well, unless you haven't spent 5 or 6 years doing some in-depth research on the topic, you don't qualify to be a faculty member. And it's an entry barrier. Sometimes it is justified, especially sometimes in technical areas it's justified. In many other areas, it's not completely clear. And that's one reason why we are seeing more and more industry professionals who are actually coming and teaching. I think it's a very positive thing when you have industry professionals coming and teaching students. And students actually enjoy the interaction with the industry professional because they bring very relevant, on-the-ground kind of knowledge, which they can be applied easily to the students' job prospects and job hopes. So I think enlarging the pool of people who teach is very important. Enlarging the pool of people who keep on learning, continuous learning is very important, because learning should not be seen as only learning when you go to a university formally for a 4-year or 3-year program. But learning is something which happens continuously all through your life, because knowledge is changing so much. You need to keep on learning. And there are, what I would say, important examples of how societies are trying to push up this learning curve. Singapore is an interesting case in point, but other countries like Finland also do this. Singapore, for example, I think gives every citizen something like 1,000 or 1,500 Singapore dollars every year for learning something. It doesn't matter what you learn. You can choose what you learn. And today online, there is so much to learn that is available. So what I'm just trying to say is that everyone can be a teacher and everyone should be learning continuously. That's the philosophy. That's the model we should be moving towards. And universities should be much more open to including more learning from industry, more learning from professionals, and not just limit them to only professors with a PhD.
And is it happening?
It is happening, but not enough. So, in many universities today, I can talk for business schools, but probably situation is similar in some other schools also. We have many industry professionals who teach in the business school or who become adjunct professors. And usually the research professors are the people who have PhDs under the core. So they control the power structure. The power structures control research faculty. And they, for example, impose arbitrary limits, saying that, well, the adjunct faculty or professional faculty cannot be more than 10% or 20% of the faculty body. So in fact, what is happening is the research faculty who control the power structure, they are using their power to control the possible dilution of their power by controlling the number of adjunct faculty. And this happens in all universities pretty much. There's a number that is allowed, but that number is usually kept small. They rarely allow that number to go, a large number, like 50, 60%. That's almost impossible to hear.
That's an interesting insight. Regarding the interaction with the industry, how can that be maximized? But are there instances where the industry itself is co-opted in the power structure at the top level in universities?
Yes and no. So I would say that most universities today realize the value of industry collaboration. So they realize the value of that. But whether or not the industry is involved varies. I think inside the university, it needs to be valued. I can tell you in America, at least, if you can actually, when you're evaluated as a professor, if you show that I received funding for X amount of money from this company, that is seen as a positive thing. It's positive because it shows that some company believed that your research that you're doing was useful enough to put money into it. So research funding that you get from universities, from companies, is a positive, let's say, factor, in terms of supporting that link. So recognition inside is very important. You also need industry that should be investing in R&D. So if universities, industry invest more in R&D, they will look for R&D partners. University, they will want to form partnerships. In India, as you probably know, the industry investment in R&D is pathetic. Okay, it's less than 1%. So in general, companies are not looking for partnerships. They're not looking for investments in R&D. Okay, so they're not looking for investment. They're looking and searching who has the knowledge, who has the technical talent, who has the young students to work with. So if industries are looking for more investments in R&D, they will naturally be inclined to form partnerships. So I think the problem is both ways. You need incentives inside universities to, go and work with companies. At the same time, you need companies who want to invest in R&D, who want to create new products. If you don't have that investment in R&D happening, then the desire to form the partnerships also is low. And that's the basic problem that you see happening in many, many countries. America has done it quite well. In America, the partnerships actually work quite strong, and it's seen as a positive thing. If for example, I have a small number of colleagues, not a large, small number of colleagues who are actually working half-time in industry and half-time in university. Okay, so these are professors, the normal professors, who were given a special leave to actually go and work for 4 years, 3 years in industry on the startup while keeping their position in the university. And this is very important because many times universities don't give the flexibility. They actually say that, well, look, if you want to go and work in industry, then you got to resign from your position in the university. But in the US, the fact that you can do both is very important. And the university actually values it. So if you actually, you're working 40% of the time in Uber, working on the algorithms, and you're working 60% of the time in the university, that's seen as a positive thing. That means that the work you're doing is actually valued by Uber, valued by the industry. So I think that kind of a culture has to come up in which the system has to become more flexible to allow for these kinds of joint, employment, joint collaborations.
And on another occasion, you had spoken about alumni. Alumni sitting on the boards or being the majority on the boards of some colleges. What is it that you were referring to?
People often ask me, why are American universities so good? Or they ask me, why do American alumni give so much money? Because alumni give a lot of money to American universities. And my answer usually is that it's not because Americans are generous. Okay, they are generous, but people are generous everywhere. Okay, so they give money because they know they can influence the institution. So in most American universities, the board of trustees are all alumni of the university. In fact, in my university in Cornell, all the trustees are alumni of the university, the successful business leaders. In fact, the head of the university, the chair of the board of trustees, who is the ultimate head of the university, the chairman of the board, he's also an alumnus. He's not a professor. And the whole academic structure reports into that board structure that is there at the top. So these people, they give money because they know that they control and they influence the university. So you give money where you feel you have some influence. If you don't have influence, you will not just give money. That's charity. Okay, charity is different from actually donating to have an impact. So donations in the US come because the alumni believe that they can actually have an impact on the university, and they believe they can have an impact because they actually control the university. And that is a good thing because they bring a lot of valuable industry connections. So then actually faculty, the university is much more connected to industry, to government, and so on. And that's actually a very positive thing.
Yeah, in fact, this resonates with what Thorstein Veblen says. Thorstein Veblen says that there is a very, he's written that book, The Theory of Leisure, about the rich. And he says that there's a very strong connection between the rich and the learned. The rich want to interact with the learned, because they want all the fine things in life, including learning. So that is why also they are very keen on investing in the chairs, etc. And they will do that only if they wield influence through such investment. So very good point. Coming to the last point, after that I will take one question. Have the Coursera's of the world challenged the established order in education? You see edtechs from Byju's to the ones which most recently came, I'm forgetting its name. They are really shaking up things. Do you feel that there might come a time when this entire business model of education will change, and what direction it is taking in addition to what you've already said?
So, it's a good question. It's a very big question. I'm not sure I have the right answer to it. I think you will always find the elite top schools who will probably keep the current model, at least close to the current model. So there will always be the IITs or the Harvard and the MITs who will probably not change too much. They will change, but not change dramatically. I think there'll be a much more dramatic change in the rest of the education sector if you leave the top 50, or the top 50 universities in any country. I think that's where you will find new educational models emerging. That's where you will find new players coming in. And the new players actually, yes, Coursera is an important player. Yes, Byju is an important player. But I think the big changes will happen when the big tech companies like Apple and Google enter education in a big way. They are just trying out. They all know education is a big domain. They all can enter and will enter at some point. Amazon has started this JE training in India, as you know. This is trying out. They're not doing Amazon any education in the US, but in India, they're trying and seeing how it works and what they can learn from it. Google has started some courses also. They're offering things. So what I'm saying is that education is somewhere these big tech players are going to enter. I don't know when they will enter. They probably will form a partnership. Let's say, for example, Apple and Harvard form a partnership. That will be, for example, a model where you have a brand, Harvard brand. Apple also has a brand and a tremendous technology infrastructure and technology ecosystem. And if you combine the two, so I do think that those kind of combinations will lead to new models coming up in the future. So that'll be, whether it's driven by Coursera or Byju or Apple, I think we'll have to wait and see. So that's something that we have to wait.
Yeah. In addition, I was missing the names, and Anand Jha, who's also a thought leader, has mentioned Upgrad, Vedantu, etc.
Yes,
but I think
of course. All of these players. So what is happening is the experimenting, Upgrad and all these people experimenting about what is the new model. And my point is that universities should also be experimenting about these things. We don't know what the new model is or should be. So there's a lot of experimentation that has to happen in this area.
Yeah, and for example, blockchain, etc., have come today. And Wall Street, knowing that what kind of disruption such technologies have caused in the past, has invested deeply in blockchain, so that if that horse becomes the unicorn, or that horse is the number one horse tomorrow, they have a bet in it. So that was a fantastic discussion, Soumitra. I just wanted to ask you two questions now. One is the top order universities like Cornell. How are you re-strategizing your outreach across developing economies with affordable tuition tailored to respective markets? Because the price of education available online has become pretty low, and some of the geographies cannot afford high-priced courses like the ones offered by the Ivy League. So what are you doing in that regard?
I don't want to speak about Cornell per se, but let me make a general statement about the top institutions in the US. Most of the top institutions in the US are just now coming out of the pandemic, crisis. And in fact, the crisis has been surprisingly good for them. When I say good for them, what I mean is there has been more of a flight to quality. So the top institutions have had more people applying to them. And so then, in fact, the applications have gone up even more than pre-pandemic levels and so on. So there is no pain in the business model as of now. So, a lot of fear was there 2 years ago, but today there's no pain in the business model. A lot of the institutions are basically doing very well. And to be very honest, making a general statement, they are so focused on their own rankings and making sure the elite status stays secure, that for most of them, there is no desire to expand into emerging markets in a big way. But what they are doing is giving scholarships to get some of the best students to come to these schools. So yeah, they're giving a small number of scholarships to attract the best students from Africa or India, whichever school. But these small number of scholarships don't really change the game. They don't change the name of the game for these emerging markets. So I think these elite institutions could do much more. Unfortunately, they're not doing enough. And at some level, I think, they are pretty content, with their position of leadership and staying where they are. They are helping emerging markets. I'm not saying they're not, but not at the scale at which they could or which is required.
So coming back to the last question, again from Anand Jha, who is a thought leader, and let me add something to that. He says, do you think the time has come for government to enable online university to give recognized degrees? And I would like to add to this. Do you think the time has come for the Ivy League or the top universities of the world to give degrees to people through the online route only?
So the answer to both questions is yes. So should the government allow online university to give degrees? The answer is yes, definitely. Of course, have some controls on quality, because there are many cases of for-profit education where the quality levels have been sacrificed. So I think that's an answer that is yes. The elite institutions also have been doing online education for quite some time. It's not just part of their own program. Most elite institutions have a public education arm, typically called the extension programs. For example, Harvard Extension, which is not the Harvard University, but is run by Harvard University for the common public. And these Harvard Extension programs actually do offer degrees also in some cases. So they are doing it, but now what is different is that the core of the universities now actually offering also degrees, and that tendency is going to keep on increasing. So I see more of it happening in the future as we go along.
Great. So fantastic speaking with you, Soumitra. You have discussed from the testing to knowledge acquisition to certification to placements in a very fluid and cogent and coherent manner. Thank you very much. And on that note, I pass on the microphone to Siddharth.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you, Pavan.
Thank you very much, sir. Such an insightful and an engaging conversation, and an absolute privilege to hear you all. Our guests and I, we've been hooked till the end and have taken home several nuggets from today's conversation. I'm also receiving messages from our members as we speak, and I really wish we had some more time. And also thank you to our leaders in the audience for joining in, and also for sharing excellent questions. Along with our weekly webinars and our publication, we're taking these discussions and conversations and B2B opportunities live on the exclusive community app for senior leaders across 20 industries. So whether you would like to engage with us, leaders are invited to join our platform. So thank you very much once again, and we look forward to having more such discussions in the future, and please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.